We've heard a lot about the need to look ahead, to look at future generations, about the effects of Hanford. We've also heard about the need to include the true stakeholders of this whole mess, which are the people that lived in the area of Hanford and are still living there. We also heard about by the Undersecretary of the Department of Energy about an organization that was spawned as a result of openness policy, the Consortium for Risk Evaluation with Stakeholder Participation. Another example of a lot of words that are presumed to give you some confidence. I just want to start out my remarks about a voluntary organization with the comment that every year this organization, CRESP, holds meetings, and you should think about the name of the conference, The Health of the Hanford Site. Last year, a few of us of Northwest Radiation Health Alliance submitted an abstract to report on the health of the Hanford people, or the lack of their health. This is a big meeting. The stakeholders are the contractors of Hanford, the Battelle Northwest scientists, all of the people that rake up the money by the millions to continue maintaining their hold on this wonderful milking cow of good living for all of these PhDs and engineers with this enormous concentration. Our paper in this whole conference that lasted 2 days was the only one that had anything to do with the people of Hanford. That gives you an idea about the stakeholders that we are talking about. Now, I'm speaking as a member of Northwest Radiation Health Alliance, a very small volunteer organization that grew out of the wishes of a group of professionals, physicians, activists, downwinders. We asked some of the downwinders that some of us have been known, that have known them for in this common fight, what could a group of physicians, scientists, people with some knowledge and at least a minimum of respectability in our society, what could we do that would be helpful to you? And out of this came this little organization. And our task, of course, is very limited, and our achievements are very, very limited. But we designed a health questionnaire because one of the recurring questions that were asked and were repeatedly brought to bear on public hearings of whether it is the technical steering panel or various panels that deal with human health and public health issues. Why don't you look at our health? Why don't you get a database together before you make statements that it couldn't possibly have happened? And that's what they always were told, including by the physicians, by the way, that their problems couldn't possibly have anything to do with radiation because it wasn't supposed to do that. And if it's not supposed to, then it can't happen, right? That's an old adage in the history of science. So the organization Northwest Radiation Health Alliance, with the help diligent help of the downwinders that we knew and the network among them, were able to distribute a very large number of health questionnaires that we tried to design. We did not do the best of all jobs because none of us had the experience, but we eventually were able to get a database of over 800 of these questionnaires, converted into a computer analyzable form, and a few of us have ever since been trying to analyze what we found and try the uphill battle to get some of these results into the scientific literature. Not that this is a great achievement, but we have at least already one publication that is out there. And let me point out that, you know, there are many, many things that need to be done. But one of the things that need to be done is to get findings about the downwinders' health into the scientific literature so that it can be quoted, that it can no longer be ignored. And if a physician says that can't be, then you can go to the physician and say, well, you better read your literature because this is a refereed article. It went through a very tough referee process, which means several other scientists that have nothing to do with the study had to pass on it. What are, at this point, our major findings? Let me tell you that. Maybe somebody can put on the next, could you put the next transparency on, please? We found a lot of hypothyroidism, obviously, and I understand from this spokesman review article, which just somebody distributed here, that apparently it leaked out that the thyroid study did find, to my amazement, I must say, because I thought it was designed not to find anything. But if, with the design not to find anything, it is true what the newspaper claims by leakage, that they did find an association of the releases of Hanford with thyroid disease, then it is not only real, but it is very, very bad. Now, what we found is that there is an association, which is not surprising to medical people who know that the thyroid isn't just something that sits here and can be treated like an individual organ, but it has something to do with the whole endocrine system of the body, that if the thyroid is diseased, it has all kinds of other influences. One of the things that we found was that there's a strong association between hypothyroidism and spontaneous abortions or miscarriages and other negative birth outcomes. Another thing that we found and is under review now is an epidemic of juvenile hypothyroidism with a peak during the years 1950 to 65, and then a second peak, which is something that we also find when we look at the adults in our sample. Now, I know that this is a self-selected group, and yet, even though with a self-selected group, it's very hard to come up with any alternative, credible hypothesis why we find what we find. So we'll see how this proceeds. Thirdly, something that in the scientific medical literature has never been linked with a few minor exceptional remarks. Hyperthyroidism, which is the overreaction of the thyroid, has never been linked officially to radioactive fallout. we, I think, have pretty good evidence that there is a link. And thirdly, when we look at cancers, we have so far focused on those which we hope will have the least problem with getting it through referees, and that is thyroid cancers and brain tumors. And we find occurrence rates, I don't want to use the word incidence because it has a very specific definition in epidemiology, about 7 times for thyroid cancers and about 5 times more than the normal US population. And we hope to include in this paper, if we achieve publication, that we believe that iodine-129, which is basically a forever living isotope of iodine, 17 million years or something like that, plays a much greater role than the official documents have ever shown. And there are several reasons why one can make that hypothesis believable. So I wanted to bring this to your attention, that a small group of individuals, provided they have a lot of stamina, a lot of energy, and willingness to do it with practically no support, still can do quite a bit. And this is what we were here today to talk about, what can be done and what really activism can do.
Thank you.
Yeah, and somebody, you're overhead.
I know we have limited time, and this speaker has an accent, I think. I wish we had more time. I know we have limited tight schedule, but I want to put an overhead in the projector. And as I said, I wish I had the time to elaborate on this concept. But what I'd like to do is just to put it there on the screen, because that is basically the notion that drives what I'm trying to accomplish, trying to do outreach with the Hispanic community. Everything that, the whole plan that I'm trying to implement is based on this concept of environmental justice. Environmental justice is the presence of equitable influence in decisions regarding environmental health, facilities and services, as well as equitable access to environmental information and benefits for all communities. From my point of view, environmental justice is a basic human right. Before I continue, I'd like to thank Tom Carpenter, and of course Pamela Burton for inviting me to participate in what I think has been a great conference. But also I want to thank those people who are sometimes, let's say, in the background, people like Angelo and Ike, who I'm sure you have seen. I really want to thank those people in the background who really help to, make these events possible. When we look around us, we find symbols. The people who came before us also saw these symbols. The eagle is a symbol. The raven is also a symbol. The sun, the moon. The salmon is a symbol of the Pacific Northwest region. The river is also a symbol. It is a symbol of life. We all have different experiences and memories. They are part of who we are, and they are part of our culture, and affect the way we see the world. The theme of this conference, A River Runs Through It, I thought it was the most appropriate name for for the event. I'm sure that it reminded you of a novel. It did to me too. I remember that novel by the same title, but it also reminded me of another symbol, and that's because I came from another place, perhaps. In the Mexican cosmogony, the rivers were symbolized by a single god called Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl was the god of life. He was the life-giving god, and is represented in the art and pre-Columbian architecture by a feather snake. The name Quetzalcoatl translates actually as a feather snake. For almost 2 decades, the Federal Emergency Farm Labor Supply Program mobilized thousands of Mexican workers, also known as Braceros. Braceros means literally armed workers, those who work with their arms. This meant the importation of Mexican labor. There were, back in the 40s and 50s, recruitment centers set up in the central states and some of the southern states in Mexico, and that's where some of the migrant workers originally signed in to participate in the program. They were put on a train and transferred to a different train once they crossed the border, and out of the probably 220,000 Mexican laborers that participated in the program, 20 to 40,000 established some migratory patterns through the Pacific Northwest. I have to wonder if these Mexicans who came to the Columbia Basin stood by the river and saw a symbol of life and a symbol of a better future. Little they knew, perhaps it could make them and their children sick. We don't know. We may never know for sure, because most of them were put in the same trains that came, where they were brought in, and they were sent back to wherever they came from. In what is one of the biggest injustices Mexican workers have ever been subject to. Many of them, however, stayed. They are here. Today, I am here to be their voice. I am doing what I can to reach out to this community of Downwinders. I cannot do it alone. HHIN cannot do it alone. Please take action. I encourage you to help me reach out to them. Let's bring the Hispanic community up to speed and into this process. Mexican farm workers have and still contribute to the economy and culture of the region of the Pacific Northwest. The river that you see out the window connects you with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith.
Thank you, Lynn. He doesn't know it. He was one of my idols when I was about 12 years old. World's best debater, and I see he's making good use of it. I live in Pennsylvania, a long way off, and it is a humbling experience to come here and to hear what I read frequently about the horror of Hanford. And I was thinking how difficult it is for those in most of the rest of the United States even to imagine what has happened to your river of life. I sat here looking at a glass of water and was overcome by a thirst and thought, what if it's not safe to drink it? And the following thought was, and this is what it's about, what if it were unsafe for a woman even to have a child, to bear the future, for fear of what we've done to the planet? I'm a geographer by training, and it breaks my heart that we've quit teaching geography to the American people, and we certainly never teach it to our engineers, who therefore don't have the foggiest understanding of what Hanford means to the environment of us all. For what is has been released, is being released, and will, unless we can be successful, be released to the biosystem, will circulate round the globe, will enter all forms of life, and impede the possibilities for the future for us all. I had expected to have much longer to talk. Let me put some copies of some of the things that I had wanted to say, and particularly a paper from a recent symposium, international symposium, held by regulators in Stockholm, Sweden. I'll put those in the back before I leave, and try to confine these remarks to just these few minutes. First, surely we do understand, and I'm thrilled with what I've heard here, that low-level radiation exposures are far damaging to human health and well-being beyond the limits of the regulations which were designed to allow the nuclear weapons and commercial nuclear industries to prosper. So low-dose radiation is really at the core of our concerns, confounded by the many other contaminants at the Hanford and all other nuclear sites. I've just been at Oak Ridge recently, and at Savannah River, and round the reactors, and at the waste sites in the eastern part of the state, of the nation. I'd like to quote, if I may, very briefly, from a medical doctor who spent a great deal of time examining atomic veterans and many downwinders. And this is what he had to say about half a dozen years ago, before we began to understand the non-cancer and non-fatal impacts of low-dose and chronic low-dose radiation exposures. The late Dr. Donnell Boardman of the Massachusetts General Hospital said in his guide to physicians for identifying and managing radiation exposures and radiation victims, he says, even at low levels, ionizing radiation exposure affects all living matter and can cause, as we know, not only cancer, leukemia, and birth defects. Many of the ill effects have been newly identified and are as yet poorly defined and understood. Their diagnosis is difficult, partly because no two people will have the same dose or the same injury, and partly because access to official records and the pertinent scientific literature is restricted. Diagnosis is also difficult because specific radiobiologic effects cannot be reproduced in the laboratory. Ionizing radiation targets only a part of any one of the billions of atoms in a single cell. Its energy is dispersed unevenly among many atoms of any of the approximately 75 trillion cells in the human body. No two will have the same clinical picture. There may be common symptoms that do not fit into the International Classification of Diseases. Doctor-patient relationship often is uneasy, even antagonistic, as both may be unfamiliar with radiation biology, and the medical curriculum has yet to include the study of these important dimensions of human irradiation. And as Helen Caldecott spoke yesterday, we're now beginning really to get the confirmatory evidence with respect to alpha particles and delayed mutational effects and impacts at the chromosomal levels that had never been anticipated before. So we are at the point now where we really need to begin the work to determine what can constitute safety for the future. Now, I want to say something very briefly that is going to be troubling, particularly to those who may work in technical realms. But I think it's time we begin to think differently altogether. After 30 years, actually, of wrestling with this issue, I have come to the conclusion as a geographer that the management of the radioactive materials and wastes that we've generated in our half century is a trans-solutional problem, which is to say it's beyond our human capability to resolve. Now, digest that. And I think you'll resist it. But you know, we are a culture that worships technology as a religion. The dogma, the faith of technology states that technologists, given enough time and money, can resolve every problem they create. Well, as a geographer, as I look at the longevity of the biological hazards posed by the billions of gallons and millions of tons of radioactive waste we've already generated, I know that the changes of the physical world interacting with the instabilities of political, economic, and social systems and our values mean that this problem transcends our capabilities. Now, that's truly terrifying. It is not said to discourage you to throw up your hands and go home. It's said to attempt to give us the recognition that it requires new, different ways of approaching the problem of the management of the radioactive materials already generated. Now, I have a few answers to Lynn's call for action. No, they're not answers. There's some suggestions that I would like to leave with you as some ways that we perhaps can go in the coming months and years and decades, lifetimes ahead of us. First, I have a radiation monitor here. It's a sweet little thing that I carry with me, a little now broken red alert. No, it does beautifully. And how many of you have your own personal radiation monitor? 1, 2, 3. Ye merciful good gods. How many of you have your own personal radiation monitor? How many of you have a VCR in the house? How many of you have stereo equipment, a radio in your car? Well, come on, folks. If you're concerned, listen, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and DOE have a new term. It's called background radiation. Do you know what it is? You know how much background radiation they say you're receiving? Well, naturally occurring background radiation is what everybody thinks they're talking about when NRC and DOE talk about background radiation. Naturally occurring background radiation, given the numbers I have here, I want to live in Portland, they're much lower than Pennsylvania, is the equivalent of, be running around 80 millirem per year, naturally occurring background. Ours, we figure 100 and a little. Get up into the mountains, it might be 200 to 300 per year, millirem per year. But the NRC will tell you, and DOE will say, background radiation now averages 360 millirem per year to an individual in the United States. Did you know that? Yeah. You know why? Because they're adding in radon, which is an indoor occurrence in some places, but they're giving an average of 200 millirem per year radon. And I've been monitoring, and I'm asking you to get the equipment and do the same thing. It isn't there. It isn't there. What has happened is that with the NCRP recommendations, empty millirem are being created for the industry to fill and still be able to say, oh, this little additional increase is very small compared to background radiation. Get it? Actually, the cumulative impact from the permissible emissions, the routine emissions, plus the accidents, and never call them incidents, they are accidents, and the intentional exposures of human beings, the experimentation. All of those have now factored in, and I think background is probably closer to 120 millirem per year in much of the low-lying parts of the United States, rather than the 80 to 100 naturally occurring. So I urge upon us the development of an independent, nationwide citizen monitoring system wherein each of us has that capability then to challenge, anecdotally true, to challenge the further lies of the Department of Energy and its other agencies. And I want us to gather those data on what is actually out there in terms of background radiation, and that can be computerized. Dan Seith of International MedCom tells me it's already underway. And I'd like all of us to be feeding in as responsible critics of the uses of nuclear energy and their impacts on the environment. And coming up, on March 28th of 1999 will be the 20th anniversary of the 3 Mile Island accident, and I was the attorney of record for that licensing before the NRC. I'd like us all to change our situation now, which is that we are still as unprepared nationwide for a serious nuclear facility accident and release as we were in 1979, when TMI melted down 50%. So that's recommendation 1. And quickly, recommendation 2.
Don't worry.
Oh, thank you. At this recent Stockholm conference, first international conference of the regulators concerning radioactive waste, to talk about health and environmental effects, first ever in 50 years. Do you believe that? EPA sent 5 or 6 people. They were co-sponsors with the Swedish Radiological Protection Board and the Stockholm Environment Institute. And NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, sent 1 staff person. The Department of Energy chose not to attend at all. At this conference, I'm not an optimist after 30 years of battling the NRC and the industry. But at this conference, I want you to know what I heard as, well, not overall, but the general tenor. First, that with respect to radioactive materials already generated, that we must achieve ways to retrieve, repackage, in order that future peoples will have an equal opportunity, environmental justice, an equal opportunity with us to be able to continue to maintain control from regulators. Secondly, that we must incorporate the consequences of low-dose radiation exposures and chronic ones, especially the internal emitters through inhalation and ingestion, the non-cancer, the non-fatal impacts into radiation protection standards. That, from regulators, is revolutionary. Third, that, this is my little favorite, they actually talked about this, with a bow to the McDonald's fast food people. Think Big Macs, multiple M, additive A, cumulative C, and synergistic S. Multiple sources, additive impacts, cumulative consequences, and synergistic relationships between radiation exposures and the multitudes of other contaminants that we've already introduced into the environment. Can you imagine regulators talking about synergistic impacts? That's revolutionary, and these are things that must must be included in our management of the wastes and materials already generated. And their fourth was that we really have to think about developing standards for the protection of other forms of life, the microorganisms, the mutating viruses, as well as simply an obligation to other life forms. Let's make that set of expectations on our behalf requirements to the agencies. Then third, I want to recommend that we work together for an end to the federal preemption over the states with respect to radiation standards and control, so that the states of Oregon and Washington can set the standards that reflect the state's concerns for their citizens. No more NRC setting regulations, EPA wringing its hands and doing nothing, but rather, oh, and of course DOE overriding everyone. In this same realm politically, coming up in the year 2002 is the renewal of the Price-Anderson Nuclear Insurance Act, and I think it'll happen before 2002, and I urge you to have a quick look at this issue. We think of it as affecting the nuclear power reactors, but it also will have a great impact on plutonium disposition and MOX, mixed oxide fuel. We need to go after that now and get, by the way, full responsibility and liability on the part of the generators, whether they are DOE contractors or the electric utility companies or any other licensee.
And that's also what pays the attorneys.
Oh, yes.
For these bastards.
Oh,
Out of
yes.
Price-Anderson, it requires it.
Yeah. I think above all, let me beg of you, I've been mostly on the reactor end of it, obviously, in the northeastern U.S. with so many. All these years, people opposing nuclear power were sometimes people who thought the Russians are coming and we've got to have nuclear weapons. Would you believe that? And many of the people involved with the DOE facilities have felt that, well, you know, we really need nuclear power. It is time for us to unify our movement to prevent these destructive uses of nuclear energy. I want us all working together to achieve the goals that we're discussing here today. Above all, the prevention of the generation of any more radioactive waste that we can't dispose of as it is. And to that end, isolation must become our term. Isolation, the goal for the radioactive materials already generated. After all, you know, what we want to do is protect people, not protect radiation, which is what DOE is doing now. And that means, think about it, isolation means zero release, and that means zero dose. And while the industry will tell you, gosh, they can't do that, then nonetheless, we have to be the ones who say that that's the goal, and every penny will be devoted to achieving the goal. Then also, to stretch Hanford beyond the states of Washington and Oregon and all the states to the east. Bear this in mind. Because the costs of the management of radioactive materials and wastes are so excessive, the industry, pushed by the Department of Energy and the utilities and NRC, is in the process of setting standards to maximize the releases of radioactive materials and wastes in recycle, deregulation. How many of you know the term below regulatory concern? That's the way they used to refer to it. But now they're talking about recycle. Everyone knows that's good. And the reuse of radioactive materials and waste, and especially the scrap metal, all the equipment from DOE facilities as they clean up, in consumer products. They've tried it before. again and again. We've stopped them in the past, and we can do so again. EPA was going to set a standard. They gave it up when they got opposition, so the NRC took it on, and the NRC is in the process of setting a standard which will not only permit the release, but it allows contractors such as BNFL to sell off as their mechanism to make a profit the radioactive scrap metal that they are recovering in the course of decontamination. And at the same time, the depleted uranium is being prepared for release and recycle into consumer products, as are, well, the norm wastes, the naturally occurring radioactive materials, which are an enormous burden, also are being considered for recycle. I urge instead that we must nationwide establish a program based upon the need to recapture and reclaim the radioactive materials already in our biosphere. And finally, the problems are international, and we must internationalize our movement for the good of us all. And thank you for your additional time.
With respect to the recycling of this material, there's a marvelous and scary article in Progressive Magazine. Irradiated spoons is what it's about. Okay. One thing I did not say, because I felt so under the gun when we began, given the fact that we were starting late, was a brief comment on the title that of this panel. Doesn't it make you sick? Well, obviously, that's supposed to be hilarious. Ha, ha, ha. I mean, obviously it does. Potential health impacts. I don't like that. I think that there's nothing potential about it. It's real, and it's been real from the beginning. The critical starting point for this entire discussion ought to be that for at least half a century, we know that nuclear radiation is toxic. We know these are not argumentative even. This is known that nuclear radiation is toxic to biological structures. It is not only toxic to animal life, it is toxic to human life. We know that it is toxic to some people and not to others on different occasions, to different structures and with different diseases. We have known that. It's absolutely individual. We therefore know that general statistics don't tell us anything about what happened to the individual, or very little. We also know, and we have known this for a very, very, very long time, that in addition to those factors, there are a whole group of other toxic factors in our society that interact with and may affect people's individual health. There's no way, if you're talking about the individual health of people or public health generally, to completely isolate radiation, nuclear effects from other toxic effects. All of this is known, and all of it has been known. And anything that says anything different or passes laws or permits scientists to look at it other than in that framework is nonsense. Now, this is, of course, precisely the reason why, precisely because all this is known, and also precisely, for one other thing, that it may take a very long time until the manifestations of it appear. Very, very long time. This makes those basic facts incompatible with the normal portions of tort law, which deal with the direct impact where causation is pretty clear and where you know that something causes something. In the whole toxic field, you don't know it as to any individual, but justice is for individuals. And justice is necessary without waiting forever for absolute knowledge. Indeed, justice is a weighing of probabilities or likelihoods. It is no more than that. It can't be. It's very different than the scientific method. And social policy is different than the scientific methods. Social policy is a matter of weighing risks and decide which ones are important. People's lives or profit. I mean, those are different things. They're different social goals. And you have to decide which one is important. So you don't operate in this field without those absolute knowledge. There's no bullshit about it. Everything I just said is as clear as can be and constitutional. That's what the constitutional principles are. So almost everything you hear is nonsense. And almost everything the judges do are nonsense, unless you insist upon those principles. Now, with that general comment, our next speaker is Jim Thomas.
Thanks, Lynn. Tom Woods this morning said, to get Hanford cleaned up, we need to get a situation where the Hanford managers have nightmares about what might happen in the future if we don't do a good job cleaning Hanford up, or at least containing the waste. The Downwinders have been suffering a nightmare for the last 50 years. They get up every day. Somehow they gather together enough strength and energy to continue through to the next day. They're a constant reminder to me that as we go through this process, we dare not tarry. In fact, just a few months ago, I lost another friend of mine who was a Downwinder who died of cancer. I've had a good opportunity to meet hundreds of Downwinders over the years of my Hanford involvement. Many of them have died. People's human and constitutional rights have been violated, and they were violated from day one. As Hanford was being constructed in 1943, the ground being broken in the spring, a man who was going to be the medical director for GE, first DuPont, then GE at Hanford, had calculated the dose of stable iodine that would block radioactive iodine from getting into people's thyroid and exposing people. They knew that if they waited a certain amount of time cooling the fuel, that the radioactive iodine-131 inside would decay away. But they shortened that cooling time. They didn't wait. They would still have gotten the plutonium. And I'm not just talking about the race to end World War II. Most of the iodine-131 that was released from Hanford in 1945 was released after Japan surrendered. So whatever you think about the ending of World War II, that really has little to do with the radiation exposure that happened at Hanford in 1945. Most of it happened after Japan surrendered. The federal government and its contractors, DuPont, General Electric, Rockwell, and the others, have been engaged in a campaign of public deception and secrecy and cover-up for 50 years. We know certain things from the documents. We know certain things from newspaper accounts, like a 1954 article in the Oregonian that said that they had already conducted 7 years of studies, and by 1954 had conducted 1,000 thyroid gland pathology exams. I'm sure that if I have, and the other people involved in the litigation, have enough time to dig out the rest of the documents, and we're successful in finding those documents, we'll find the reason why there hasn't been health studies is that they weren't, not that they weren't conducted, but that the results haven't been made public. I've also heard a lot about, especially from DOE. DOE is, in the budget wars, is playing cleanup versus the downwinders. But that's silly. We here in the Northwest, we here who live next to Columbia, we're one community. Casey and the others who live in Richland and the Tri-Cities know this very well. The exposed, those suffering, and the others involved in cleaning up and making sure that future exposures do not happen, we're all the same. We are one community. We cannot let DOE off the hook by allowing them to set the debate. It's cleanup dollars versus money for the downwinders. No. We have to hold our federal government accountable as one community. There is enough resources. I mean, this year we had a budget surplus of billions of dollars. The downwinders are not asking for much, but we are asking for justice. I think with one action item is the assistance of those involved with cleanup and environmental groups to help the downwinders and vice versa, to end the cover-up. What they're covering up is not just how much radiation was released from Hanford, not just how much they knew about the health effects even back in the 40s and 50s, but they're also covering up about the waste. My colleague, former colleague at HEAL, Todd Martin, he tells me that the first documented tank leak in Hanford documents is about 58, 59. I talked to a Hanford worker and downwinder, a retired worker. He was an engineer at Hanford in 1949. One of his tasks was to deal with a tank leak. So even what we have in the documents is not necessarily the truth. We have to go beyond that and to work together to find out the truth. And just in closing, I've been in this for 15 years. The thing that keeps me going is, to a large extent, the power and the hope that I gained from my Catholic Christian faith. And to help you all in the struggle, I want to leave with you two sections of Scripture. The first one is from Matthew, and Jesus was instructing his disciples as he was sending them out on a mission. He says to them, "So have no fear of them, for nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret that will not be made known." And also from the prophet Amos, "Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Thank you.
I've been a very neglectful or poor follow-up chair. I had asked one or another people to talk about three things. Jim I'd asked to talk about the Hanford case because he's involved in it. It's essential that you understand, at least in a rudimentary fashion, what's going on, and I had hoped Jim would do it. I'll do it. I know how to do it. All right, go ahead and do it, because we've got to talk about it. It's got to be on the agenda here. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, situation with the Hanford lawsuits. There are two downwinder lawsuits. The first one was filed in 1990 and was consolidated. There was actually 4 or 5, and they were consolidated in 1991. That has been very slow, mainly to the Department of Energy's dragging their feet on releasing documents. In last month, or now it's about 6 weeks ago in August, federal judge Alan McDonald handed down a ruling in response to motions filed by the defendants, primarily DuPont and General Electric, that moved for summary judgment to dismiss most of the Hanford downwinder claims. McDonald pretty much accepted wholeheartedly the arguments of the defendants, but has done it in such a way that rides roughshod over the law, rides roughshod over the science, and misapplies it, and also does not offer any kind of guidance to the plaintiffs, or for that matter, the defendants, as how to apply the ruling to the individual plaintiffs. So it's almost like he started another phase of litigation, and the ramifications of that remain to be seen. Those plaintiffs will file an appeal in the Ninth Circuit. They have good grounds. The law firm I work for is with a second lawsuit. It's very similar, but it's legally it's a separate action. The defendants and the judge are trying to put the same kind of criteria on the plaintiffs we represent, even without us offering one, let alone a full range of expert testimony, which is in total violation of any kind of due process rights. And that we're fighting. So that's about where it stands. The papers have portrayed it as something that's, and DOE has lauded the judge. They had a press conference a couple days after the ruling was handed down, and were just frothing at the mouth with platitudes for the judge, because it gave the DOE pretty much everything it wanted. But it won't stand. I don't see how it can. If it stands, I think not only will the Downwinders be victims, but our entire system of democracy. Thank you.
He's too polite. Jim is in a position where he's too polite, and I'm not polite. Judge McDonald, for 8 years, knowing from the beginning what he was ultimately going to do because his prejudices have been obvious, is a lawless, devious, reckless man. That's the nicest thing I can say about him. He did in this case, if it stands, and for some technical reasons I believe it might, it may take away the rights, if followed by any other jurisdictions, and it might be, of all people who are the victims of radiation fallout of any kind. What in substance he did in a 760-page opinion was to spend 690 pages of it throwing out the testimony of 14 experts, all of whom were qualified scientists, and all of whom were called for varying kinds of proof over a question that should never have been asked. The question was, can you prove generically, that is for everybody, generically for everybody, can you prove, can you mount evidence for everybody that there was causation in terms of a legal proposition, not a science or a medical one, but a legal proposition, that it is more likely than not, which means more than 50%, you know, more than likely than not, it means it has to be doubled risk, as did everybody. Now, the question is an absurd and unscientific and inappropriate question. And anybody who permitted it or even accepted it should be drummed out of the law, as far as I'm concerned, or should be subject to malpractice. I mean, the idiocy of accepting that is beyond my understanding. Okay. That can't be the question. If that's the question, you lose. because everybody, every individual has to have his own case on causation. And there wasn't enough of a database precisely because people didn't get the information. So even the best of scientists couldn't possibly put that together because it doesn't exist very well, at least. So it was impossible. The second thing is that the question of who you believe in a conflict of opinions belongs to whom? Juries. Remember? Did you ever hear of a jury? This judge, for 690 pages, dissected in a pretty lunatic way, although very devious and clever, the testimony of scientists and made what he thinks was a scientist opinion that they were unreliable and therefore they couldn't be heard by a jury. Now, the arrogance of that goes beyond any arrogance I have probably ever seen, except he's probably a psychopath. So, you know, it's expectable. Now, this is so outrageous. This is so outrageous that it beggars the imagination. And I don't know how to express enough rage. I have more rage than I can contain, but I am going to write about it. Once before, he tried to seal some testimony, a very important testimony, and when I talked about it, because I got it, he threatened to throw me in the hoosgow, and he still hasn't, and I dared him to. And the other day on KOMO TV, I said, I hope he sues me for defamation. I really want that. Or I hope he tries to take away my bar ticket. Let him try. Let him try. I mean, this is just terrible. Just terrible. Okay? Now, there were two other things I thought we ought to talk about because they're very important in terms of the cover-up, and I don't know that we have time now, but one of them is this Hutchison Hanford thyroid disease study cover-up issue, and this is a very important issue in this community, and I don't know who's going to bring it out, but it's current and it's important and it's pretty immediate. And it is a cover-up in my judgment, at least, although they are trying to cover it up with a lot of PR. And the other one was this astonishing 12-year, or whatever, how many years was it, Rudi, since I finished it, in the Nevada test sites? 8, 12, I think? Yeah, 8, 10, 12 years. They hid the the results because they were so terrible from the viewpoint of the nuclear industry. So in 1997, they had a hearing, which was a remarkable hearing on why they didn't release it, and how they came and what they were doing and what was going on and what was this cover-up about, and we got some partial answers, and then they finally did release it, and then there was another hearing just last month. And there's some remarkable stuff that came out of it, including a great statement by PSR and a number of other things that really we ought to be aware of. So the cover-up at an official level is now getting to be real hot. It's real hot. And we should have cover-up on our lips every moment. I mean, just take one last thing and I'll shut up for the rest of the day. How many people in this room believe what tobacco executives say? Now, you're biased probably, but I bet you if you went to the American people and asked the same question, they all had the privilege of watching these 8 guys stand up and say nicotine isn't addictive. How many people here would believe under oath before Congress, anybody in the nuclear industry would tell them, well, you know, it's low-level stuff doesn't... For 50 years they've known differently. Is this a bigger lie? Is this a different lie? Of course not. This is the greatest hoax, lie, perjury that you've ever seen. It's not just because you were screwing around with a woman. It's about the fate of the world, for heaven's sake. And who would believe anybody from the nuclear industry on this issue? Nobody should believe them at all. I'm through for the day.